Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very glamorous. And by glamorous, I mean the exact opposite. Forget kings, queens, and castles for a while. Forget silk sheets and feather beds. Tonight, we're curling up with the people who didn't have all that. Your average medieval peasant. The folks who, somehow, managed to get through the night in little mud and wood huts that were about as cozy as a damp potato sack. So, dim the lights, grab a blanket, ideally one not full of fleas, and let's slowly drift back into the Middle Ages. Imagine it's night. It's winter. You've worked all day, your back hurts, and now you get to crawl into a smoky hut where the main goal is not comfort, not even rest, but survival. Because medieval sleeping was basically a game of don't freeze to death. Now, the first thing to know is this. Medieval huts weren't houses the way we think of them. They were more like boxes. Wooden frames plastered with mud, straw, and manure, because, of course, manure was involved. Why not make the walls smell faintly of cow? And the roof? That was usually thatch, a flammable roof that doubled as a mouse hotel. So already you're sleeping inside something closer to a compost pile than a cottage. Inside, there wasn't much separation between living space and sleeping space. You didn't have bedrooms. You didn't even really have a bed, not in the sense of a modern bed. The family just sort of picked a spot near the fire pit or stove, if you were lucky enough to have one. Which brings us to the single most important medieval bed accessory: smoke. See, huts didn't have chimneys. The smoke from your fire just sort of filled the room and slowly drifted up through the thatch roof, which meant that peasants slept in smoky huts every single night. Imagine falling asleep while your eyes sting, your lungs wheeze, and your hair smells like you've been barbecued. Congratulations, you've just recreated the authentic medieval bedtime vibe. But hey, the smoke wasn't all bad. It actually kept away bugs. Fleas, lice, and mosquitoes didn't love smoky air. So yes, your lungs hated it, but your skin was slightly less itchy. A fair trade if you ask medieval peasants. And honestly, most of them didn't have a choice anyway. Now let's talk about the beds themselves. The classic option was straw. Not hay, that's animal food, but straw, which is basically the stalks left after harvesting grain. You'd stuff it in a sack and throw it on the floor. That was your mattress, a lumpy bag of sticks that had all the cushioning of a broken doormat. Every so often, you'd renew the straw, dump it out and replace it, because otherwise it got moldy, smelly, and even more full of little insects that wanted to nibble on you in your sleep. If you didn't have a sack, you just scatter straw directly on the floor. Maybe throw a blanket or old cloth over it. And yes, the straw definitely had mice in it. Basically, medieval peasants didn't sleep alone. Ever. And no, you didn't get a nice fluffy pillow either. At best, you had a wooden block or a rolled-up piece of cloth, which means, yes, your neck was sore every morning. And let's not even talk about the blanket situation. Wool was expensive, so most peasants had only one or two rough blankets, shared with the whole family. And that's not family in the cozy sitcom sense. That's parents, kids, and sometimes grandparents all huddled together in one pile for warmth, because body heat was the best heater peasants could afford. And this wasn't optional. Medieval huts were drafty, and winters were cold. Without piling bodies together, you risked not waking up in the morning. So picture this: mom, dad, 3 kids, and maybe a baby, all tangled together under one itchy blanket. The dog might be in there too. Maybe a chicken. It sounds absurd, but animals were part of the warmth system. Bringing your animals inside kept them alive during the cold months, and also made the hut a few degrees warmer. Yes, medieval people literally slept with cows. Not metaphorically, literally. Cows, goats, pigs, all snoring a few feet away from you. If you think your roommate is annoying, try living in a one-room hut with a pig rolling around in the straw while you try to fall asleep. Now, let's float over to the other fun detail of medieval sleeping: darkness. Because we forget how dark the pre-electric world was. Once the fire died down,
Your hut was pitch black. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Which sounds kind of cozy until you remember you're in a room full of animals, children, straw, and smoke, and you're just hoping the thatch roof doesn't decide to catch fire while you sleep. And this wasn't just one 8-hour snooze. Medieval sleep happened in 2 parts, first sleep and second sleep. You'd go to bed a little after sunset, so maybe 8 or 9 p.m., sleep for a few hours, then wake up in the middle of the night. This was totally normal. People would stir, maybe tend to fire, talk quietly, sometimes even pray. Then they'd drift off into second sleep until dawn. So in a way, medieval peasants invented the midnight snack and scroll routine, just without the snacks or the scrolling.
Of course, not every peasant slept in misery all the time. Some did okay. A well-off peasant might have an actual wooden bed frame with ropes stretched across it to hold up the mattress sack. That's where the phrase, sleep tight, comes from. The tighter the ropes, the less saggy your bed felt. And yes, the ropes had to be tightened every so often, otherwise your bed collapsed into a hammock of sadness. Now, did medieval peasants dream of comfort? Absolutely. They knew nobles had feather beds, linen sheets, and velvet curtains to block the draft. Meanwhile, they were waking up with straw stuck to their faces. And it wasn't lost on them. Comfort was a visible marker of wealth. Your bed said everything about your social class. If you had curtains around it, congratulations, you were basically showing off. Curtains weren't just for privacy, they kept heat in. Imagine that luxury, a bed that wasn't freezing. But back in the peasant hut, luxuries were rare. What you got was what you made. A rough bed, a smoky ceiling, and the warmth of whoever or whatever was willing to curl up next to you. And yes, if that meant snuggling your goat, then your goat became family for the night. Because when the choice is frostbite or goat cuddle, you pick the goat. So to sum up this first drift into medieval bedtime, huts were smoky, beds were straw, everyone piled in together, and animals snored alongside humans. No one was really comfortable, but everyone survived, mostly. And somehow, despite the smoke, fleas, and lack of pillows, peasants did what people always do. They slept, they dreamed, and they got up the next morning to do it all again. So, we've established that medieval peasants slept on straw sacks next to pigs in smoky huts. Romantic, right? But sleeping wasn't just about physical survival. It was also about spiritual survival. Because in the Middle Ages, the night wasn't just dark, it was terrifying. Let's start with the obvious. No street lights, no lamps outside, no glowing city skyline. When the sun went down, the medieval world was swallowed in complete blackness. And blackness meant danger. Wolves prowled around villages. Bandits lurked on roads. Even if nothing was actually out there, people were absolutely convinced demons and ghosts were. The night belonged to things you couldn't control, which meant bedtime came with a side of fear. And how did peasants cope with that fear? Prayer. Lots of it. Bedtime prayers weren't just a sweet nightly habit, they were a shield. Because in medieval Christian thought, nighttime was when the devil worked hardest. So before you lay down on your wool blanket, you'd cross yourself, whisper a few lines to the Virgin Mary or your patron saint, and hope you made it through to dawn without demons breathing down your neck.
And yes, they really did believe demons could come at night. Nightmares weren't just dreams gone wrong. They were thought to be demonic attacks. If you woke up sweaty and panicked, that wasn't indigestion. That was the work of a demon sitting on your chest. Literally. In fact, the word nightmare comes from the old idea of a mare, a malicious spirit pressing down on you while you slept. So when little medieval kids woke up screaming, parents didn't say, "Oh, honey, you had a bad dream." They said, "Yep, demons again." Very reassuring. But it wasn't just demons. There were also witches. Medieval people believed witches did their best work at night, sneaking into homes or riding broomsticks around villages. If your cow mysteriously stopped producing milk, maybe it wasn't cold weather. Maybe your neighbor had bewitched it sometime during the hours you were sleeping. So, as if smoke-filled huts and flea bites weren't enough, peasants also had to worry about supernatural sabotage. And let's not forget death. People genuinely feared dying in their sleep, and with good reason. Life expectancy wasn't great, and illness could take you out fast. Going to bed each night wasn't a guarantee you'd get up again, which is why the classic bedtime prayer was, essentially, "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep, if I should die before I wake." Comforting, right? Nothing like tucking your child in with a reminder of their mortality. Now let's float back to something a little less spooky, the routine of night. Remember how peasants often had first sleep and second sleep? That in-between period in the middle of the night was a weird liminal time. People might wake up, poke at the fire, or even do chores quietly. Some used it for prayer, believing midnight was a particularly powerful hour for connecting with God. Others, well, let's just say marital relations were often slatted into this midnight intermission. Which makes sense. Hard to get privacy when the whole family is sleeping in one pile. But in the middle of the night, you could maybe sneak off to the edge of the hut and hope the goats weren't watching. Seasonal changes made a difference too. In summer, nights were shorter, and sleeping on straw was sweaty, itchy misery. In winter, nights were endless, and every ounce of warmth mattered. That's when the pile-together method really counted. You wanted as many bodies under the blanket as possible, like a low-budget human radiator. And if you were lucky, you might even have a sheepskin or fur thrown over the pile. Not luxury, just survival. Of course, hygiene didn't exactly help. Straw beds collected sweat, dirt, and lice. Bedding wasn't washed often. In fact, sometimes it couldn't be washed because peasants didn't own enough fabric to spare. So people literally slept in the same grime day after day. If it got too bad, you just dumped the straw, shook out the blanket, and hoped the fleas went somewhere else. Spoiler, they didn't. And let's not forget the smell. You've got unwashed bodies, smoky air, damp straw, and animals in the corner. Add in the chamber pot? Yes, people kept them nearby at night, and you can imagine the fragrance. A medieval hut didn't smell like lavender sleep spray. It smelled like smoke, manure, sweat, and goat. But hey, it was home. Sometimes peasants used herbs to make it all a little more bearable. Lavender, sage, or even just dried grass might be stuffed into bedding to mask the smell and maybe calm the nerves. Because yes, even in the Middle Ages, people liked the idea of a soothing sleep scent. It's just that instead of a $30 candle, it was whatever plant they had in the garden. Now, speaking of herbs, let's talk about medieval sleep aids. Alcohol was a big one. A mug of ale or weak wine in the evening was basically the peasant version of a sleep potion. It wasn't strong, but it took the edge off, warmed the belly, and made it easier to ignore the fact that your pillow was a wooden log. On the other hand, monks and physicians sometimes recommended poppy or lettuce as mild sedatives. Yes, lettuce. Apparently, lettuce juice was thought to be calming, so the medieval version of counting sheep was probably just, well, eating a salad. But beyond the practicalities, sleeping in a medieval hut was profoundly social. You didn't drift off alone, scrolling on your phone in the dark. You were surrounded by the breathing and snoring of your entire family. You listened to the crackle of the fire, the occasional grunt from the pig, and the wind pushing through the thatch. The night wasn't silent. It was a chorus of human and animal noises. And in a weird way, that was comfort. You weren't isolated. You belonged to a household, a unit, a little bubble of life huddled against the cold. And despite everything, the fleas, the demons, the smoke, people did sleep. Not luxuriously, not peacefully, but enough to survive and keep plowing fields the next day. Which, really, was all medieval sleep was about. Survival. Luxury was for kings. Peasants just needed enough rest not to keel over in the middle of harvesting wheat. So, when you tuck yourself into your memory foam mattress tonight, maybe spare a thought for the medieval peasant. Imagine falling asleep in a smoky mud hut with a goat breathing beside you, praying that demons leave you alone and that the straw doesn't catch fire. Somehow,
they managed. And they did it for centuries.
So far, we've curled up in the smoky huts of your average medieval villager. But of course, not every medieval sleeper had the exact same setup. Where you lived mattered. Geography shaped comfort. And by comfort, I mean the relative difference between freezing on straw in a mud hut and freezing on straw in a slightly better hut. But hey, in the Middle Ages, even small upgrades counted. Let's start with the rural peasants we've been talking about. These were the majority of people. Farmers, laborers, serfs. Their huts were simple, one-room structures. Wood, wattle, and daub, maybe some stone if you were lucky. Roofs thatched with reeds, dirt floors unless you'd packed them with clay. Beds were straw, blankets were scarce, and smoke from the fire filled the room. That's the baseline model, the peasant standard edition. Now, if you move into a medieval town, things get a little more interesting. Townsfolk weren't usually rich, but they often had slightly better housing. Stone or timber-framed houses, wooden floors instead of bare dirt, maybe, if you were lucky, a chimney. Which meant, yes, the house still smelled smoky, but at least you weren't coughing up a lung every night. Beds in townhomes were often a step up too. Instead of just a sack of straw on the ground, you might have a wooden bed frame with ropes stretched across it. And on those ropes, a straw mattress. Still lumpy, still itchy, still full of creatures that considered you dinner, but at least you weren't literally on the floor with the chickens. Towns also introduced one luxury rural peasants rarely had: textiles, linen sheets if you could afford them, wool blankets that were actually thick, curtains around the bed. And here's where we need to pause, because bed curtains sound small, but they were a big deal. In a drafty medieval house, curtains trapped heat. They made a private bubble in a world where privacy was rare. Plus, they looked fancy. Nothing said, "I'm doing all right," like a bed that came with its own tiny fabric fort. But before we get carried away with the urban luxuries, let's be real. Most townsfolk still weren't living like kings. Plenty of families still slept multiple people to a bed. Children piled together. Apprentices bunked in attics. Servants rolled out on whatever floor space was available. The idea of one bed per person was practically science fiction. And let's not forget, towns came with their own problem: noise. Instead of cows in the corner, you had neighbors yelling, carts rattling, cats yowling, and bells chiming at ungodly hours. So while you might have had a bed frame, you also had to get used to medieval sound pollution. Now, for the real upper crust, wealthy merchants, guild leaders, minor nobility, the bed was no longer just a place to sleep. It was a status symbol. Big wooden frames, feather mattresses, yes, actual feathers, and layers of linen, wool, and fur. Imagine sinking into that after years on straw. It was basically medieval heaven. And of course, the bed itself was carved and decorated, because why not turn your sleep station into a furniture flex? Some even had testers, canopies above the bed, complete with heavy curtains. So if peasants had smoky huts, rich folks had indoor tents. And that wasn't just for warmth, that was theater. Your bed was your throne of unconsciousness.
But here's where the contrast gets funny, because while wealthy people invested in huge, elaborate beds, they still had the same basic problems as everyone else. No central heating, drafty walls, no glass windows in most cases, just shutters. So yes, your bed might have silk sheets, but if it was -10 degrees outside, you were still huddling under blankets, hoping your toes didn't turn into icicles. Luxury in the Middle Ages was relative. Let's float back, though, to peasants and their household bed politics. Who actually got to sleep where? Parents usually claimed the best spot, closest to the fire. Kids clustered around them. Older children might be shoved farther out toward the colder edges of the hut. Servants or extended family, they got whatever corner was left. And if you were really low on space, people slept sitting up on benches or even curled near the warmest wall with a dog. Which, to be fair, doesn't sound entirely terrible compared to being crammed in a bed with 6 siblings. Animals still played a role too. Even in town, stables were often part of the house, or built onto it. Heat from the animals helped keep human spaces warmer. So, once again, sleep was a community event. Humans, dogs, cows, and chickens all contributing to the nighttime symphony of snores, grunts, and occasional barnyard aromas. And while we're comparing classes, let's not forget monks and nuns. Their sleeping arrangements were different again. Monks often slept in dormitories, rows of beds or mats in one big room. Privacy? Non-existent. Comfort? Minimal. Monastic rules emphasized simplicity. So mattresses were straw, blankets plain, and pillows optional. You weren't there to be cozy. You were there to train your soul. And if that meant sleeping cold and stiff, well, consider it holy character building. Nuns, on the other hand, sometimes did slightly better. Their dormitories could be warmer, and they sometimes had curtains around their beds for modesty. Still not luxurious, but compared to a smoky hut with goats, it was practically a spa. And of course, monks and nuns didn't have kids crawling over them in the middle of the night, which probably helped. Now, stepping back, what's striking is how much sleep reflected status. Your bed, your blanket, even your sleeping posture, these were all indicators of who you were in medieval society. Were you a peasant on straw, shivering with the pigs, or a merchant under wool and fur, inside a curtained bed frame? Or a lord sinking into feathers, surrounded by carved wood and velvet drapery? Sleep wasn't just about rest. It was about class, wealth, and the story your body told while unconscious. And yet, no matter the differences, everyone in the Middle Ages shared the same basic truth. Nights were cold, beds were imperfect, and the darkness was total. Rich or poor, you whispered prayers, wrapped yourself tight, and hoped the sun would rise again. Because even the finest bed couldn't banish the fears that lived in the medieval night.
So far, we've been focused on families and households. But here's the thing about the Middle Ages. Travel happened. Pilgrimages, trade, business, and the occasional running away from your feudal lord situation. And when you were on the road, you couldn't just book a hotel with a private suite. Medieval inns were, well, let's just say they took the concept of shared space to a whole new level. At an inn, you didn't get your own bed. You didn't even necessarily get your own blanket. Beds were communal. If you were lucky, you shared with a friend or family member. If you weren't, you ended up spooning a complete stranger. And no, you didn't get a choice. If you wanted a place to sleep, you climbed into whatever straw mattress had room. Travelers, merchants, peasants, even nobles on the road, it didn't matter. The innkeeper shoved people in together like sardines in itchy linen. And let's be honest, this was awkward. Imagine ending your long day of trudging along muddy roads, finally paying your coin, and then being told, here's your bed, and here's your random snoring roommate. And remember, hygiene wasn't exactly a strong medieval virtue. You had no idea if the guy next to you was carrying fleas, lice, or just an impressive collection of smells. Spoiler, he was. Now, to be fair, there was etiquette about bed sharing. If you had to bunk with someone, you were expected to behave. No hogging the blanket, no unnecessary touching, no rolling over and pretending the other person was your spouse. Basically, the same unspoken rules we have when we sit on a crowded bus seat, just stretched across 8 hours of forced sleep. But, of course, rules don't always work. There are plenty of medieval jokes, poems, and complaints about bed sharing gone wrong. People stole covers. They kicked each other in their sleep. They snored like dying donkeys. And because privacy was non-existent, any strange habits, talking in your sleep, thrashing around, dreaming out loud, were on full display. By morning, everyone in the bed knew way more about you than they wanted. And inns weren't exactly the Four Seasons. Straw beds were rarely changed, and when they were, it was just new straw. Blankets were recycled from guest to guest. So along with sharing the bed with strangers, you were also inheriting whatever lice and smells the last dozen guests left behind. Honestly, it makes the smoky hut with your goat sound almost appealing. Now, bed sharing wasn't just about inns. It happened in daily life too. In towns, apprentices often shared beds with each other, servants shared with servants, children piled in together. Even adults sometimes shared with siblings or cousins well into adulthood. And in some cases, bed sharing was part of hospitality. If a guest visited your home, you might literally give them half your bed. Not the guest room, not the couch, half your mattress. And this was considered polite. Here, sleep next to me. We'll chat about the weather until we drift off. Royalty and nobility weren't exempt either. Even kings sometimes shared beds, though in their case it was usually with political allies or trusted companions. Bed sharing wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Sharing a bed meant intimacy, trust, and loyalty, even if it wasn't romantic. It was basically the medieval version of a handshake, just horizontal.
And this is where we hit another cultural quirk: same-sex bed sharing. In the medieval world, this wasn't considered odd or scandalous. Two men, even grown men, could share a bed without anyone raising an eyebrow. It was normal, practical, and widely accepted. It wasn't about romance. It was about survival, convenience, and sometimes politics. Of course, centuries later, historians read back into it with suspicion. But at the time, it was just life. Beds were scarce, nights were cold, and body heat was free. Now, what about couples? Married couples, at least, usually got their own space, though that space was still often shared with children. A husband and wife might technically have a marriage bed, but it wasn't exactly private. Kids might be asleep at the foot, or servants in the corner, or in some cases, random travelers passing through. Intimacy and privacy were luxuries the average medieval household simply didn't have. And speaking of kids, they often stayed in the parents' bed for years. Not just newborns, older children too. Families were big, space was small, and keeping everyone together was easier, which meant medieval parents became experts at the fine art of pretending to be asleep when they absolutely weren't asleep. Of course, not every culture in medieval Europe handled sleep the same way. In Scandinavia, longhouses packed entire communities under one roof, so bed sharing reached epic proportions. Picture 30 or 40 people, plus animals, all sleeping in a single smoky hall. Privacy level? 0. In warmer southern regions, people sometimes slept outdoors in summer, on rooftops or courtyards, which honestly doesn't sound too bad compared to a flea-ridden straw sack. But no matter the region, one thing stayed consistent. Beds were social. Sleep wasn't a solitary activity. It was about family, community, and survival. Your bed was where you bonded, argued, snored, and occasionally got kicked in the shins. It was messy, crowded, and sometimes downright unpleasant, but it was normal. And maybe that's why medieval people had so many rules and customs around sleep. They needed them. When you're crammed into a bed with strangers at an inn or with your siblings every night of your life, you learn fast that bed sharing isn't just physical, it's political. It's about negotiation, compromise, and not getting elbowed in the ribs at 2 a.m. So the next time you crawl into your big, clean, private bed, imagine a medieval inn. Imagine 4 strangers under one blanket, all trying to stay warm, all praying no one brought lice, and all wishing for dawn. And remember, in the Middle Ages, sleep tight wasn't a cute bedtime phrase. It was survival etiquette.
So far, we've mostly treated the medieval bed as a sad, smoky survival station. But here's the thing. Beds actually mattered a lot in the medieval imagination. They weren't just furniture. They were stages. Important life moments played out on them. And for some reason, medieval people loved turning those scratchy mattresses into symbols of, well, everything. Let's start with birth. If you were a peasant woman giving birth in your hut, the bed was the obvious place. But it wasn't exactly a private hospital room. Birth was a community event, with neighbors, midwives, and maybe a priest all crammed in. And yes, it was messy, which is why people often had birthing sheets, special linens kept aside for labor. Not exactly satin, more like the blanket you were okay with ruining forever. For wealthy women, though, the lying-in chamber became a whole production. Curtains were drawn, candles lit, prayers said. A noblewoman would give birth in her massive curtained bed, surrounded by attendants. And the bed wasn't just furniture, it was the center of ritual. After birth, the mother would literally lie in for weeks, confined to bed as a form of recovery. So in medieval culture, beds were tied to the very beginning of life. You didn't just arrive in the world, you arrived in a bed. Now, let's skip ahead to the other end of life, deathbeds. This is where the symbolism gets really heavy. To die in bed was considered the good death, peaceful, natural. Dying anywhere else, on the battlefield, on the road, in the fields, was messy, uncertain, even spiritually dangerous. So people prayed to have a deathbed moment, time to confess sins, receive last rites, and say goodbye. And yes, families gathered around the bed, priests showed up with holy water, heirs leaned in, waiting for the last will to be spoken. Beds weren't just physical, they were legal. A nobleman might literally transfer property rights from his mattress, dictating inheritance while gasping for breath. And then, once he died, the bed itself became symbolic. Sometimes the bedcloths were burned or the frame dismantled to mark the end of a life. So the bed wasn't just where you lived, it was where you ended. Now here's the odd twist. Beds were also political. In royal and noble households, the bedchamber was a stage for power plays. Monarchs received visitors in bed. And no, that's not in the fun way. Kings and queens often held bedchamber audiences, lounging among pillows while courtiers whispered advice. To be allowed into the royal bedchamber was the ultimate mark of trust and intimacy. It meant you were part of the king's inner circle, literally inside his private sleeping space. In fact, beds were so politically charged that positions like groom of the stool or gentleman of the bedchamber existed. Imagine telling your family, yes, my job is to watch the king get ready for bed. It sounds bizarre now, but back then it was high status. You were closer to the royal body than almost anyone else, which meant influence. And in medieval politics, influence was everything. Marriage, too, revolved around beds. The consummation of a union was considered official only once the couple had shared a bed. And awkwardly, this was sometimes witnessed. Yes, nobles and royals might have attendants or clerics peek into the room or even sit nearby to make sure the marriage was sealed. So, once again, the bed became a stage, not private, not personal, a literal performance of dynastic continuity.
And speaking of dynasties, let's not forget the bed's role in inheritance. Beds themselves were valuable property. They showed up in wills. A good bed, complete with sheets, blankets, and curtains, could be one of the most expensive items in a household. People passed them down through generations. Imagine being told, "Congratulations, son, you've inherited this saggy straw sack full of lice. Treasure it always." Of course, for the poor, the symbolism was a little less glamorous. Births still happened in huts, deaths still happened in beds, and marriages were still consummated under blankets that probably hadn't been washed in years. But even there, the bed carried meaning. It was the center of family life, the one piece of furniture everyone shared, the place where all the milestones, however messy, took place. And beds even crept into literature. Medieval romances and epics are full of bed scenes, not just for sex, but for symbolism. Heroes resting, villains plotting, kings dying, saints receiving visions. The bed was a place of vulnerability, intimacy, and revelation, which, when you think about it, makes sense. The bed was where you stopped performing for the outside world. It was your private stage, even if it was full of goats. So if we zoom out, medieval beds weren't just about sleeping. They were cradles, thrones, confessionals, death stages, and sometimes legal offices. A single straw mattress might see birth, sex, sickness, political decisions, and death all in the same space. And honestly, maybe that's why medieval people took them so seriously. In a world where life was fragile, fleeting, and public, the bed was one of the few consistent fixtures. So, tonight, when you climb into your memory foam and Netflix cocoon, remember, you're lying in something medieval people saw as the ultimate stage of life. From the first cry to the last breath, the medieval bed was where it all happened. Just maybe without the curtain-witnessed consummation part. Hopefully. So here's a fun bedtime fact. Medieval people didn't sleep the way we do. You, me, and most of the modern world aim for one long block of sleep, roughly 8 hours if we're lucky. Medieval peasants? Not so much. They had what historians call segmented sleep. The night was divided into 2 chunks,
first sleep and second sleep. You'd tuck in after sundown, doze for maybe 4 or 5 hours, then, poof, you'd wake up in the middle of the night. This wasn't insomnia, this was normal. People would sit up, poke at the fire, pray, chat, even visit neighbors in the dark. And after an hour or two of this half-awake limbo, they'd drift back into second sleep until dawn. It's weird to think about, but it actually makes sense. With no electric light, night stretched on forever. If you went to bed with the sun, you could rack up a solid 12 hours in bed, but your body doesn't need 12 hours of unconsciousness, so nature broke it up. And instead of fighting it, medieval people leaned in. They even wrote about it. References to first sleep and second sleep show up in literature, medical texts, and diaries like it was just part of life. What did people do during this midnight window? Some prayed. Monks used it for extra devotions because of course they did. Housewives might get up and mend clothes or check on food. Farmers could tend animals. Couples might use it for sex. In fact, some medical writers recommended it, claiming the body was most fertile after first sleep. And naturally, some people just sat there in the dark, staring at the fire, contemplating how cold their toes were. Now, along with this segmented sleep pattern came the medieval obsession with dreams. With the midnight wakefulness came plenty of time to recall and interpret them. Dreams weren't just random brain static. They were messages, warnings, maybe even divine revelations. Priests and scholars spilled gallons of ink writing dream manuals, explaining what it meant if you dreamed of, say, wolves or bread, or a strangely specific number of goats. Spoiler, it usually meant taboo. Dreams were also tied to medicine. Doctors believed certain foods, humors, or even phases of the moon could influence your dream quality. If you dreamed badly, it was sometimes treated as a symptom of imbalance. So your midnight visions weren't just entertainment, they were taken seriously, sometimes too seriously.
Let's float for a moment into the soundscape of the medieval night. Picture lying there, half asleep, listening. No traffic hum, no airplanes, just the occasional owl, the wind rattling your thatch, maybe a fox crying like a banshee in the distance. But there were human sounds too. Peasants lived close to each other in villages where walls were thin and huts even thinner. You could hear your neighbors snoring, babies crying, or the smith next door coughing through the night. Privacy didn't exist. The night was communal, whether you liked it or not. But let's not pretend medieval nights were all calm and cozy. They could be scary. Darkness carried danger. Wolves, bandits, spirits, at least according to local folklore. If you were unlucky enough to be out in the fields after sundown, you were vulnerable, which is why the bed, scratchy and lumpy though it was, felt like a little fortress. Curtains around wealthier beds weren't just for warmth. They were psychological shields against the creeping dark. And of course, churches shaped the rhythm of sleep. Bells rang at ungodly hours to call monks and nuns to prayer. In monasteries, segmented sleep was practically mandatory. You'd get a few hours in bed, then be dragged out at midnight for vigils in the chapel, chanting in the cold until your fingers went numb. Then a little more sleep before dawn prayers. No wonder monks wrote so much about the spiritual benefits of suffering. They were just really tired. Back in peasant huts, the rhythm was tied more to work. In summer, people rose ridiculously early, sometimes by 3 or 4 a.m., to get chores done before the sun got too hot. In winter, morning stretched later, but the segmented sleep still held. And if you couldn't sleep, well, you weren't alone. The middle of the night was when some of the strangest, most liminal human activities happened. Quiet conversations, secret meetings, maybe even a whispered deal in the barn while everyone else slept. One of my favorite oddities is how often medieval sermons and writings use the metaphor of sleep and wakefulness. Being spiritually lazy was described as being asleep. Sin was compared to lying in bed too long. Waking up at midnight to pray was seen as proof of holiness. So the physical act of sleep spilled over into the moral world, which meant, ironically, that your humble little straw pallet was a site of theological drama.
Now here's where things loop back to modern life. Historians like A. Roger E. Kirch, who did a ton of work on sleep history, argue that segmented sleep wasn't just medieval, it was natural. Humans might be wired for it. Electric lights changed everything, forcing us into one continuous block of sleep. So when you find yourself wide awake at 3 a.m., congratulations, you're basically living like a medieval peasant, just without the goat farting in the corner. So, to wrap this dreamy section, medieval nights were long, broken up, and full of odd little interludes. Sleep came in chunks. Dreams were taken seriously. Darkness was both a threat and a blessing. And beds weren't cocoons of isolation. They were noisy, communal spaces in a noisy, communal world. Next time you wake up at midnight and panic that you can't fall back asleep, remember, a medieval peasant would probably just shrug, poke the fire, say a prayer, and accept it as normal. Maybe even get up to bake bread. Your insomnia might not be broken at all. It might just be medieval.
If there's one thing that defined medieval sleeping, it's this. Beds were social spaces. They weren't little private bubbles. They were where relationships were negotiated, where boundaries were tested, and where communities lived, quite literally, together. We've touched on bed sharing before, but in the last part of our sleepy saga, we have to go deeper. For most people in the Middle Ages, sleeping alone was a luxury reserved for the very rich or the very dead. Peasants, artisans, servants, and even some nobles slept in shared beds, and not always with who you'd expect. The most common arrangement was the family bed. This wasn't just parents and children. Sometimes extended family piled in, grandparents, cousins, apprentices. The bed was a literal nest, keeping people warm and conserving precious space and fuel. Privacy? Forget about it. Privacy was a luxury. Sleeping was communal by necessity. And then there was the custom of guests sleeping in your bed. Hospitality in the Middle Ages was taken very seriously. If a traveler arrived at your door, refusing them bed and board was considered rude, sometimes dangerously so. But not every house had a spare bed. The solution? The guest joined the household bed. A servant might move aside, or the family might shuffle together to make room. That was normal, that was polite, that was life. Even in towns and cities, inns rarely offered private beds. Instead, beds were communal sleeping spaces, with strangers piled together under the same blanket. It was practical, economical, and socially accepted. Yes, you might wake up to a snorer, a thief, or a stranger's bad dreams, but it was the price of shelter. Bed sharing also carried social meaning beyond necessity. Among nobles, who slept with whom could be a statement of trust or influence. Invitations to share the royal bedchamber could mark favor or political alliance. Beds were stages for negotiation and patronage. They were microcosms of power. Even the position you slept in mattered. Closest to the fire meant warmth, but less privacy. Furthest meant safety, but cold. For ordinary people, the communal bed also built relationships. Siblings learned cooperation in the dark. Families bonded through shared warmth. Even communities formed a kind of collective life in sleep, where privacy was sacrificed for survival. This wasn't just a practical habit. It shaped medieval culture's sense of intimacy. To sleep alone was unusual, even suspicious. It suggested you were either very rich or very strange. There were also seasonal variations to communal sleeping. Winter meant bodies packed closer for warmth. Summer sometimes meant sleeping apart to avoid overheating. Yet the rhythm of shared sleep persisted year-round. In some villages, people even kept traditions like the first sleep being communal before breaking apart for second sleep. Sleep was a rhythm of social life as much as of biology. And let's not forget the symbolic layer. Bed sharing was also about trust.
Letting someone sleep beside you was offering vulnerability. It could signify friendship, loyalty, or alliance. In medieval culture, beds were more than objects. They were stages for human connection. So when you think of the medieval bed, think of it as a microcosm of society. It was messy, it was crowded, it was noisy, it was warm and smelly and intimate. It was where life happened. Birth, rest, illness, confession, death, dreams. Beds were survival hubs, moral stages, political theaters, and social arenas, all rolled into one. And maybe that's the last lesson of medieval sleep. It wasn't just about rest, it was about being together. It was about sharing warmth in a cold world, sharing shelter in the dark, and sharing life in the small, cramped space of a bed. So tonight, when you turn off the lights and slip under your own blankets, remember, medieval peasants and kings alike spent their nights in ways we can barely imagine. Sleep was noisy, communal, symbolic, seasonal, and utterly human. And maybe that's the most comforting thought of all, that across centuries, through straw beds, segmented sleep, plagues, and frost, the simple act of lying down to rest was still one of the most human things we do. Good night.